Hello, and welcome back to the Whole Bible series. This week we are doing an introduction to the historical books. So we just finished going through the books of the law, or the Pentateuch. We are now entering the next section of books in the Old Testament, which is known as history or the historical books. So the historical books in the Old Testament are Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. In the Hebrew Bible, or the Tanakh, those books take shape a little differently. So, for instance, you see here 1 and 2 Samuel are combined, as are 1 and 2 Kings, and 1 and 2 Chronicles. Also, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah are combined into a single book called Ezra Nehemiah. The Tanakh also breaks these out differently than we do. So whereas we call them the historical books, for them, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings would be called the former prophets. And those would come before the latter prophets, which are what we know as the prophets, which we'll get to later, the major and the minor prophets. And then they also break the other books, Ruth, Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles, into another section of scripture called the writings. So the historical books are largely written in the genre of prose narrative, very similar to the Pentateuch that we just went through, but they're also going to have other genres mixed in, such as poetry and genealogies, lists, letters, and so on. So who wrote the historical books? So very similar to the Pentateuch, there are some Hebrew traditions about who wrote some of these books, although many of them, if not all of them, are anonymous. There's no writer identified within the book itself. Hebrew tradition does attribute some of these books, specifically Joshua, Samuel, and Ruth, to Joshua and Samuel. However, there are some issues with that. For instance, in both Joshua and 1 Samuel, the people who supposedly wrote the books die before the end of the book, and so you have somebody else finishing the book. So therefore, they couldn't have written the entire book, but that doesn't rule them out of writing a vast majority of it. Also, there are other issues. There are several of these books in these historical books that really flow together, and they have repeated uses of certain phrases that really makes a scholar today look at it that one single person either wrote these books or came in afterwards to edit these books. Now, we do have some solutions to these issues, these dilemmas, such as having Joshua with a biblionic editor coming in later to finish up his book, and the same thing with Samuel. He obviously couldn't have written 2 Samuel because he died during 1 Samuel. And there is some tradition that he wrote Ruth as well, but Ruth makes a statement in Ruth 4 that seems to rule him out as the original writer, at least having someone come in later to edit the work, just as we have with a lot of these books. So you could have both Joshua and Samuel doing some of the writing with somebody else coming in later. You could also have a bunch of different writers writing different portions of the history, and just have someone in a later era come in and bring it all together and edit that so that it seems to all flow together. There is also another theory called the Deuteronomist writer theory. This comes out of the JDP hypothesis, which we discussed back in episode 2. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about that, you can go back to episode 2 to dig into that a little bit. But with this Deuteronomist writer theory, it says that Deuteronomy through Esther is written by this single writer, but that excludes the book of Ruth. So that is a theory that is out there, although it may not be very likely. More likely that we had miscellaneous writers and then one or a few editors come in later and clean everything up. So getting into the historical timeline of the historical books. So we talked previously about the time of the Exodus and that there were two dates largely proposed for the Exodus, both the early date, which is approximately 1446 BC, as well as a late date, which is approximately 1270 BC. And so the historical books cover a period post-Exodus from either approximately 1406 or 1230 BC until about 430 BC. So we're covering about 1,000 years or so in this next section of books, in the historical books. So what do we know for sure? So we know pretty well that King David reigned approximately from 1010 to 970 BC. So here's a quote here from the Lexham Bible Dictionary. It says, historians and biblical scholars largely agree on absolute dates for Hebrew history back to the reign of King David. So we can't go much further beyond that. We can kind of guess at the times of Saul, but before that, it's a little bit more muddy. And so there's not the same clarity that we have from the time of King David forward. Going back to the quote, which began around 1010 BC. This understanding of Old Testament chronology is based on the work of Edwin Thiele, who first demonstrated the soundness and reliability of the Old Testament chronological data. So if these dates for King David are true, then that puts King Saul's reign approximately starting about 1050 to 1010 BC, and then puts the period of Judges that comes before Saul and after the Exodus. The period of Judges then runs for about 200 to 380 years, give or take, based on whether you use the early date or the late date of the Exodus. Let's go to another quote from a book called Interpreting the Historical Books. In reconstructing biblical chronology, scholars first attempt to determine a fixed date or dates. This is done by correlating biblical and ancient Near Eastern data. According to the Assyrian records, there was a solar eclipse in the year of Ursagili, an Assyrian governor. This can be dated June 7th, 763 BC. 90 years before this, 853 BC, in the 6th year of his reign, the Assyrian ruler Shalmaneser III fought against a Western coalition at Karkar. King Ahab of Israel, so this is the northern kingdom, King Ahab of Israel was a member of this coalition. In the 18th year of his reign, 841 BC, Shalmaneser III received tribute from King Jehu of Israel, also from the northern kingdom. According to the Old Testament, 12 years separate the reigns of Ahab and Jehu. So Ahab's reign ended in 853, while Jehu's began in 841. With these years in place, scholars can then use the biblical chronological data to date the reigns of the kings before and after this. The division of the kingdom occurred in 931 BC. Solomon's reign began 40 years before this, in 971 BC, according to 1 Kings 6:1. Solomon began building the temple in his 4th year, 966 BC, 480 days after the Exodus from Egypt. And one takes this figure literally, then the Exodus occurred in 1446 BC. In this case, Joshua's invasion of the land took place in 1406 BC. We'll pause there. So again, 1446 BC, going back to the last page, is the early date of the Exodus. So working backward from these dates that correlate with the Assyrian data, we get the date of 1446 BC. If we take the 480 years literally. Let's continue here. However, not all scholars are convinced that this dating scheme for the Exodus is correct. On the basis of archaeological and biblical evidence, some place the Exodus in the 13th century. They regard the figure of 480 years as stylized, representing 12 generations, which would have encompassed approximately 300 years. So this takes into account that in many places in the Bible, the writers of the Bible correlate a generation to approximately 40 years. And we see this in the desert, right? So God says to the Israelites that all of the people who didn't believe him about coming into the promised land were going to die off, and we would wait till the next generation. Well, they spent 40 years in the wilderness until that generation died off. And so 40 years is largely symbolic of a generation within the Bible. So if we take the 480 years as representing 12 generations rather than a specific period of time, then the late daters, again here around 1270 BC, can make their chronology work by saying that we have 12 generations within a 300-year period rather than the full 480 years. So here is a list of the kings of Israel with their approximate dates that they reigned, both in the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. So we'll go through this just a little bit. We'll see here on the top, you have Saul, who's the first king of Israel. So this is the United Kingdom. You have Saul, then David, then Solomon. At that point in 922 BC, the kingdom divides into the southern the southern kingdom of Judah and the northern kingdom of Israel, or is sometimes called Ephraim. So we have Judah and Ephraim, or Judah and Israel, as two kingdoms from that point forward. And so we have a genealogy of kings in both kingdoms until these two kingdoms get conquered. So we see here at the bottom of the kings of Israel on the right, you see a note there saying that Israel assimilated by Assyria in 722 BC. So the northern kingdom of Israel, or Ephraim, was conquered by Assyria in 722 BC, and they took the majority of the people out of the land and mixed them up. And so we'll get into that more when we get to that portion of scripture. But basically, Assyria, what they would do is, in order to have peace, or at least to squelch any resistance that they might have in the future, they would take a people, conquer them, and then remove them from their land and spread them out all amongst all their other conquered territories. And so there would be no single culture left. All these cultures would be mixed, and the people would be mixed. And so it was less likely that a people would maintain their own culture, but would rather assimilate into the Assyrian culture, number one. And number two, it was less likely that these people would get together to try to fight back, to have resistance against the kingdom of Assyria. We also see here on the left in 586 BC that Judah is conquered and exiled by Babylon. So the Babylonians come in 586 BC. They destroy Jerusalem. They take much of Judah back to Babylon and keep them as captives there. And they are there for approximately 70 years. So here we see a little bit of a timeline around the time of the Babylonian exile. So this is the southern kingdom of Judah in Babylon. And so we see just a few different things going on here. So on the top, we have the areas in green that show a portion of the time when approximately when these prophets, Jeremiah, Daniel, Hezekiah, or Zechariah, Malachi, Haggai, when these prophets lived. And that's what the green arrows represent. On the bottom in gray, we have different important people. So Josiah was one of the last king of Judah. And so you see, or one of the kings of Judah, you see his name here in 640 BC. Let's go back up here. So we see Josiah right here. He's one of the last kings of Judah. So there's 4 more after him. But he happens around 640. That's when he is in rule. And then you see Nebuchadnezzar, which is the Babylonian leader, Belshazzar, Cyrus, Darius, and then you get into Xerxes and Artaxerxes, and then Darius, which are part of the next kingdom to come in after Babylon. You also have some notes in here talking about deportations and the falls and when things happen. So we have the fall of Jerusalem in 586. This is when the city and the temple get destroyed and the people get taken out and exiled to Babylon. And then they're gone approximately 70 years total between the destruction of the first temple and the building of the second temple. And then we see down further around 480 BC. This is when the story of Esther takes place. And then further down, Ezra and Nehemiah. So this is when the temple had already been rebuilt and completed back in 517 BC, but Ezra and Nehemiah come in the mid 400s and help to rebuild not only Nehemiah helps them rebuild the walls of Jerusalem for protection, but Ezra, being a priest, kind of brings the people back to God and back to the law. And so that's very important. From that point forward, about 430 BC or so, until 0 AD approximately, the time that Jesus is born, somewhere in between 4 BC and 0 AD, we have a gap of literature. So as we finish up the Old Testament, we'll see that there's a gap of approximately 400 years or so where there's no writings. It's actually referred to as the silent period, where there's no prophets on the scene telling the people what God wants. And so we'll have some time to get into that as we finish up the Old Testament, but just trying to lay down some groundwork so you guys understand where we fit in this historical timeline as we go through these books. So here is a complete Old Testament chart going from the time of David to approximately that same time. So we'll see here about to 480 BC. So here, let me explain this a little bit. We'll be using this one more as we go throughout the rest of the Old Testament, just so we have some continuity. On the top, you have the kingdom of Egypt. And so you'll have the Egyptian rulers up there, as well as some of the events that happen within the area of Egypt. Next, you have the area of Canaan and what happens with the kingdoms of Israel and the people later on as they come back to the land. The purple area is the kingdom of Syria. The brown is the kingdom of Mesopotamia. And then the green area is the northern Mediterranean world. So this is the Greeks and the Romans and that kind of stuff. And so as we go through, I'll kind of point out where we're at on this chart. We'll circle some things, kind of help you guys see where we fit at. But you see the timetable on the top there. It goes from approximately 1000 BC, which is around the time that David begins his reign, into about 480 BC. So this will help us get through the majority of the Old Testament, and you guys will be seeing this quite a bit. So I just want to introduce you to it, let you get a little bit comfortable with it, and if you have any questions, let me know. So why were the historical books written? So the historical books were written as a chronicle. So similar to the Pentateuch, you know, the writers are really trying to remind the people of why they were called and what they were called to do, and for them to understand who God is and what their part in the covenant is. Well, the historical books are written similarly as a chronicle for the Hebrews, so that they can remember all that God has done, all that He's doing, all that He has promised. And as we will see later on in the Old Testament, when they do get exiled from the land, they know that God keeps His promises, both good and bad. And so this period of these historical books and the prophets, they really remind the people about what God has promised to do, both good and bad. So how accurate are the historical books? That's the final thing that I really want to touch on. All right, so we talked a little bit about how accurate the Pentateuch is before, but how accurate the historical books are, we have a little bit more evidence here, extra biblical evidence that helps us to feel more comfortable sometimes with how true the stories here are, because we have correlation and evidence. So let's read another quote from Interpreting the Historical Books. When people hear the word history, they usually think of dates, names, places, and events. History writing is not usually a popular genre of literature, for people typically think of it as a dry record of bare facts about what happened in the past. For this reason, some might shy away from reading the historical books of the Old Testament. However, a closer look at the literature reveals that it contains many exciting and fascinating stories, and most people, especially in our contemporary and postmodern context, love a good story. Because of this literary dimension, the historical books read more like a historical novel, complete with plot structure and character development. God Himself even appears as a character in the unfolding drama. When one considers that these stories are true, they take on a special relevance. In fact, of all the stories that have been written in human history, the biblical stories are the most relevant, for they alone are inspired scripture. And let's continue that by looking at some archaeological evidence. So here on the top, we actually have a little chart showing that we have correlation from not only Israeli, or I should say the area of Canaan evidence, but we have evidence from other kingdoms surrounding Israel. There is mentions of these different kings of both Judah and Israel in these other archaeological evidences, these pieces of archaeological data, these pieces of pottery or stelas or stones. There's evidence from these other nations that reference these kings of Judah and Israel in their approximate timetables that we have written down based on the biblical evidence as well. And so there's much correlation for the reigns of these kings and for knowing that these kings actually existed. And so as of recently, we had evidence of at least 18 of the biblical kings, of Israel's kings, in these different kinds of archaeological pieces. So that's almost half of the kings that are in the Bible from the kingdoms of Judah and Israel. Almost half of those are mentioned in other nations. Also have two articles here that I'd like to show you. Let's see if I can pull them up here. So the first one says, this is from 2013. It says, Israel Archaeological dig provides evidence of King David's reign. So largely before this, a lot of people doubted that King David was real, that they thought he was a mythological invention from the Hebrews. And in the last 80 years plus, we continuing to find more and more archaeological data. And as archaeologists are more active in these areas in and around Israel, they're finding more and more correlation that the things in the Bible are true. So let's go ahead and read the article real quick. It's fairly short. Israeli archaeologists claim that they have found a palace belonging to King David in a Judean historical site that they have been excavating for the last several years. The discovery of the ancient city of Khirbet Qeiyafa by researchers Yossi Garfinkel and Sar Ganor lends credence to the existence of a royal kingdom under David in Judea, as indicated in the Bible. Digging has been going on in Khirbet Qeiyafa for the last 7 years, according to a report from the Jerusalem Post newspaper on July 18th. The excavation is a joint effort between Hebrew University and the Israel Antiques Authority. As archaeologists dug, they discovered evidence that the site was a fortress in the 10th century BCE. That's before the Common Era, is what BCE stands for. When David is said to have lived. So this lines up with the times that David reigned, from approximately 1010 BC to 970 BC. The ruins are the best example to date of the uncovered fortress city of King David, said Garfinkel and Ganor, who led the excavations. This is indisputable proof of the existence of a central authority in Judah during the time of King David. Garfinkel claimed in 2012 that the discovery of the fortress itself provided proof that David was more than a myth or minor figure in history, the UK's Daily Mail newspaper reported on July 20th. All right, so it goes on. You guys can go read it if you like. We'll jump over to this other article real quick. New finds suggest biblical kings David and Solomon actually existed. So again, a lot of archaeologists and a lot of lay people even and other scholars didn't believe that King David and King Solomon, that these were historical people, but rather that these were inventions made up by the Hebrew people as, you know, a mythology of how powerful they was. So again, I can send you guys these links. I'll actually put these links in the description so you guys can click on them and read them yourself. But I just wanted to show you those because those are really interesting. All right, so let's get back here. So we have lots of archaeological data, and the archaeological data continues to compile every year. They're finding newer and newer things to corroborate things that happen in the Bible. So should we look at the historical books as historically reliable? Yes. Yes, we should look at them as historically reliable. And there's some things that we can talk about. Not everything is meant to be taken literally in the Bible and in this portion of the Bible, but we'll talk about those things as we come upon it. But as for the happenings of Israel and the kings of Israel, I think that it's fair to say that they're very historically reliable. So if you have any questions, I'd love to field them. You go ahead and comment below, and hopefully we can get off to a good start here in the historical books. Thanks for your time, and have a great day.